establishing queenside influence early. This English opening gambit seeks to restrict black's development and potentially build an imposing pawn chain. Developing the knight to this square immediately prepares to challenge the center and can quickly join the fight for key squares. Asserting central dominion immediately shapes the board, challenging black's knight for critical squares. Opening a diagonal for the dark-squared bishop while solidifying central control, a common and sound reaction to the English. Developing this knight reinforces central control and prepares for further pawn expansion, aiming to squeeze black's position. Developing the bishop to eye the knight on c3 creates immediate pressure and contests white's central ambitions. Fortifying the center and preparing for kingside development, this solidifies white's pawn structure while allowing piece activity. Developing the queenside bishop with tempo while preparing to challenge the center's control. Developing the knight to e2 supports the d4 pawn while preparing to castle kingside, aiming for a solid pawn structure. Solidifying the queenside and preparing kingside castling, this bishop's retreat unlocks the d-file for potential pressure. Challenging the bishop's influence, this pawn advance probes for weaknesses while securing queenside space. Prioritizing development, the bishop relocates, preparing to castle and support the central pawn structure. Sacrificing space now aims to unlock central lines for your pieces and potentially trap the bishop. Securing the monarch against the advancing pawn storm prepares for a solid defensive posture. Preparing to challenge the dark squares, this knight repositions for a potential kingside assault. Expanding on the queenside immediately creates dynamic imbalance, aiming to exploit the slightly passive nature of white's knight placement. Breaching black's pawn chain creates an open path for white's pieces, aiming to exploit the exposed king. Opening the f-file dramatically alters king's safety and pawn structure. Sacrificing the knight opens a dangerous diagonal towards black's king, creating immediate tactical possibilities. Asserting central control, black immediately challenges white's ambitious knight, aiming to disrupt the pawn structure and create dynamic play. Targeting weaknesses near the black king, this knight's repositioning initiates a dangerous pressure campaign. Reclaiming that central space feels natural, solidifying black's pawn structure while preparing for potential counterplay on the queenside. Seizing central space with this pawn thrust immediately challenges black's queenside pawn structure and opens lines for white's pieces. Unveiling the queen to c7 prepares for central pawn advancement and better defensive coordination. Reclaiming the knight repositions it to a more active square, potentially eyeing squares like c7 or d6 again. Shifting the queen back to b7 secures it from immediate attack and prepares for a potential queenside expansion. Unlocking the kingside opens pathways for swift attacks, but weakens the central pawn chain. Reclaiming central space, black bravely sacrifices a pawn to activate the knight and destabilize white's kingside pawn structure. Solidifying the advanced knight's position and eyeing potential queenside advances. Challenging white's central dominance, this pawn push aims to break open lines for black's pieces and create counterplay on the queenside. Repositioning the knight to the c3 square aims to challenge the advanced pawn structure and prepare for potential central pawn pushes. Striking at the pinned knight immediately disrupts white's central control and opens the door for black's pieces. Opening the b-file for your rook fundamentally changes the central dynamic, preparing for an aggressive queenside pawn push. Sacrificing material to open the g-file is a bold attempt to exploit the exposed king. Controlling the open b-file now prepares for an eventual queenside siege and pressure against black's kingside pawn structure. The queen vacates the b7 square, eyeing the kingside and offering potential central redistribution. Challenging black's kingside defense with aggressive rook placement. Sacrificing the bishop for initiative reveals an aggressive intent, aiming to disrupt white's coordination. Unleashing the king from its protective pawn shield presents a daring, if precarious, opportunity to activate it. Consolidating the rook on the 7th rank signals an intent to contest the open files and pressure white's potentially exposed king. Unleashing the queen, white aims to exploit the exposed black king and initiate a devastating mating attack. Suddenly, black aims to exploit white's awkward rook placement and attack the unguarded queen. Unleashing the queen to eye the weakened kingside, threatening a powerful cavalry charge. Unpinning the knight frees the d-pawn for a central advance, though it leaves the king a tad exposed. Reclaiming the initiative, white forces black to account for threats against the king's safety. Reinforcing the central dark squares now aims to disrupt white's kingside pressure and prepare counterplay. A bold repositioning, aiming to exploit the open g-file and pressure the weakened dark squares around black's monarch. Securing the king's safety is paramount after white's recent aggression. Asserting dominance on the open files and preparing to flood the kingside with attacking pieces. Challenging white's queenside pawn structure, this knight finds a more active outpost. Securing the king amidst chaos, a necessary defensive posture to survive the onslaught. Sensing a subtle shift in the queenside dynamic, black anchors their queen, aiming to solidify the pawn structure and coordinate defense against white's unleashed attacking potential. Repositioning the knight aims to bypass the e-pawn's block and potentially target the weakened kingside. Seizing the c4 pawn suddenly opens lines and creates dynamic possibilities. A critical exchange, liberating the queen but leaving the kingside pawn structure compromised. A bold sacrifice opening lines to exploit the exposed king for counterplay. Opening the f-file grants crucial attacking potential against the enemy monarch's still exposed position. Recapturing the pawn dramatically simplifies the position and ushers in an endgame where white's king feels exposed on the kingside. Knight aggressively spearheads into the weakened d-pawn structure, seeking out black's scattered pieces. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure, now prepares for a more active endgame. Asserting dominance on the 7th rank, this rook creates immediate pressure, forcing black to confront the lingering positional weaknesses. Solidifying the king behind the pawn chain, anticipating an eventual skirmish for central control. Activating the rook to contest the open file offers a dynamic counter-initiative, vital in this tense middle game. Challenging the rook's dominance, this pawn advances to disrupt white's coordination and create defensive space. Clearing the path for the rook's decisive infiltration and initiating a queenless middle game. Activating the rook to contest the crucial open file solidifies black's defensive structure and prepares for future counterplay. Exploiting the open file, white forces a pawn exchange to solidify control and pressure black's weakened structure. Asserting presence on the queenside, this thrust aims to disrupt white's rook and potentially create passed pawns. Probing the rook's new outposts, this knight maneuver aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and create tactical opportunities. Trading this bishop simplifies the position dramatically, opening lines for your rook to exert pressure. Unlocking the d-file dominance, this exchange opens lines for white's remaining rook, aiming for a decisive positional advantage.